May I help you?
I'm here to see David Remnick.
Certainly.
What is it that makes the New Yorker so successful?
I don't know. I sometimes think that it's a little bit like what Louis Armstrong said about jazz. If somebody asked Louis Armstrong, what is jazz? And Louis Armstrong says, if you don't know, I can't explain it to you. It's just, there's a, Harold Ross, who began this magazine in 1925, thought up this formula of humor and reporting and fiction, and the formula evolved. Not like Coca-Cola, you know. It wasn't as scientific as that. It was much more human and effervescent and deep. And this recipe of what the New Yorker has kind of developed over time, and different people go to it for different reasons. Some people go to it because they want a quick laugh when they see the cartoons. Some people go to it because they feel that the press in some way is too shallow, and they need more depth when it comes to not only the great issues of the day, Iraq or global warming or AIDS in Africa, but also stories about American life or life abroad that they're not going to get anywhere except in a kind of almost capsule form. So that's a big part of it. Another part of it is not just the brain, but also the heart, which is why fiction is such an important part of the magazine, and poetry as well. It's not as if I imagine that we publish poems every week and therefore sell 1 million issues of the magazine. But for the people to whom it's important, it's intensely important. So there are all these parts of the recipe that make it delicious and a little hard to define. Why is cassoulet good? Is it because of the beans? Probably not. It's something about the way things
which
are put
part
together.
in this soup is, in this pot, is the most important, would you say?
I think that depends on the reader. I think we put equal effort into all the components of the magazine. The cartoonists pour themselves into the cartoons, just as the reporters who are going to Afghanistan pour themselves into that. I think there's some combustible aspect of the magazine in a good way. You know, the combination of humor and seriousness and care. I think that's a big important part of the magazine too. Is care. The care of editing and checking and copy editing. That is done in a very intensive and I think fairly unique way, is also evident to the reader. They sense it, they know it, even though maybe they don't know every law of copy editing themselves or see every refinement in the magazine. They feel the care that goes into it. I hope so, anyway. It's like a piece of furniture, you know? You get this great piece of furniture, and you don't know much about carpentry, and you don't know necessarily much about stains or lacquers or the artistry of carpentry, but you appreciate the whole, and you can't quite put your finger on or your vocabulary on what makes it so. But if the New Yorker is any good, it has that reaction in the reader.
I understand that. It's a fine work, but it's not a mass magazine, and still you sell over 1 million copies.
I don't know what that means, a mass magazine. You mean like Us Weekly or People or something like that? No, we'll never sell that number of issues. But it's also not a literary quarterly. It's a weekly magazine with advertisements for fashion and movies and all kinds of entertainments. It's not a hermetic quarterly about abstract poetry, although it has things in it that are difficult. Look, I'm firmly of the belief, and I think it's not the prevailing belief, that people are not stupid. That there are people that don't just want things that are deep or beautiful or maybe even elusive, but people who crave it. It's a big country, 300 million people.
Who are the readers? Can you describe them?
I think it's a vast range. I think it's, you know, it's not just a magazine of urban sophisticates on the Upper West and East Side of Manhattan and Santa Monica or something like that. I think it's much more variegated than that. We meet some of our readers once a year. I'm going to have to sneeze. Hold on one second. I assume you're going to slice this all up in like little salami. So, you know, we get a chance to meet our readers once a year at this New Yorker Arts Festival. that we do, and it's terrific. Lots of young people go to the fiction readings. Maybe some older people go to see Tom Stoppard being interviewed by John Lahr, our theater critic. So it ranges in age, it ranges in geography. More people read this magazine in California than they do in the state of New York, which is maybe a surprise.
How old are they in average?
Well, the average is probably in the 40s.
Late 40s.
Pardon me?
Late 40s.
46, I think it is.
That's your age.
It's 1 year younger, so it's a very young audience. I don't, I don't follow this stuff. I'm not a marketer. I don't have focus group meetings to figure out what you want to read and what you want to read and what you want to read. I don't care. I only care in an abstract way. What I edit the magazine for is what I want to read and what our writers want to write, primarily, so that their heart and souls are really in it, so that it's not a job, it's not cut and paste. So that the magazine, if you take the magazine and take the metaphor of a restaurant, there are many magazines that you compare to McDonald's, which is to say, not to insult McDonald's, but you know exactly what you're going to get and in what proportions, and what it's going to taste like in Arizona is the same as what a McDonald's is going to taste like in Chicago or Miami or Buffalo or Stockholm. It's what it is. This magazine is more like the kind of restaurant that a friend recommends to you in some odd village in Paris or the Napa Valley or wherever, and you kind of run into it, and it's run by mom and pop in the back, and they come out and they tell you what you're going to eat today. And one Monday is going to be radically different from Tuesday, and it all depends what they got at the market that day and all the rest. It's homemade.
You have very strong-willed cooks in that restaurant.
Yeah, sure.
And you have the best pens writing for you. Some are also very eccentric. How do they take fact-checking and rewriting? And
well, those are two different issues. Fact-checking, they had better take well, because we're not going to publish something under the rubric of nonfiction that is false, made up, helped along, plumped up. It's just not going to happen, not while I'm editing, and I don't think any of my predecessors would put up for it. We don't rewrite people willy-nilly. The editors here are not a rewrite bank like at a wire service or a newspaper where you're rewriting police stories as it comes in. This is not a machine product. The editors are here to get the best of those writers, to help them realize, in the best of all possible worlds, what the piece of writing they set out to do. I'm not here to try to make Joan Didion sound like Alice Munro, or Alice Munro sound like John Updike, or George Packer sound like somebody else. We want George Packer to be the best that George Packer can be. So it's a collaborative process. Editors certainly have influence in the best of circumstances, but they're not here to turn John Updike into something that he's not.
do they accept it freely?
I think the best writers, when they're in the hands of a good editor, accept it very readily. Because the best writers know the difference between what we call shit and shinola. So if you tell John Updike, you already said that 4 paragraphs back, or this unusual word that you're using here, you used it already, and so it's going to have not a very good echo. It's a mistake, essentially. And he'll consider it, and he'll change it. Now, if he's in the hands of somebody that's a mediocrity as an editor, he's not going to listen. Why would he? And if that editor goes too far in trying to push and pull and make the story something that Updike doesn't intend, then obviously he's not going to. But in the hands of a good editor, I think the best writers are really responsive.
Can you describe concrete the process of writing here with the editors, how you work? How many people are involved in a story and so on?
It's a good question. Every writer has an editor, one of the senior editors. In other words, there's me, I'm the editor of the magazine. There's an executive editor and a deputy editor and editorial director. They're sort of at the top of this odd construction, although it's quite informal, it's small. And then there are senior editors, and they all have a group, any number of writers that they work with at any one time, maybe 7, 8, 9, 10. So piece is agreed to, assigned, we're talking about nonfiction now, the piece comes in, a first draft, the senior editor reads it, and if it's ready to sort of go into the process, I'll read it, others will read it, make suggestions or not, and then it begins going through an editorial process that involves fact-checking, the lawyer, copy editing, possible rewrites in conjunction with these suggestions. It's rather complicated, or maybe more ornate than some other magazines.
I like to go more into depth.
I would say by comparison to other places, it's a fairly heavily edited magazine.
If we still stay with the writing and later speak about the fact-checking, but with the writing, you put the same effort basically into everything that's printed in the paper.
I hope so. I hope so.
So a long story as well as a short story in Talk of the Town.
Look, a short story in Talk of the Town, which is 800 words, as opposed to a 20,000-word piece of nonfiction, obviously it's a difference in scale. And anything that grows larger than a certain point has also parameters of structure that an 800-word story does not. In other words, the trick with a 21,000-word story, there are a lot of them, but one of them is the ability to sustain interest. What you don't want is somebody reading 3,000 words and getting the gist and throwing it aside. And so you need to work very hard. I'm talking about as a writer, and I do both. Figure out what the scale of your project is, how it moves. I mean, rather like a novel, only you're dealing with facts. And the scale has to be equal to the task. I just published a long profile of Bill Clinton, and the centerpiece of the story was a trip through Africa with him. But I used that narrative of the trip through Africa with set pieces dropped in here and there about politics or other subjects. And so that structure was probably the most important thing to figure out, even if it's just a sketch on the back of an envelope. Because if you just start writing willy-nilly, and you have this massive 21,000-word thing, you're going to produce a disaster. Heaven's Gate will be the result, if you remember that disastrous
I do
movie.
remember that. So that means that you actually work a little bit like a book publisher.
I'm talking about the writing now. I'm not talking about publishing or editing.
But
I'm just talking about conceiving how a story is told. Look, it's the same thing in the way a joke is told. A professional comedian can tell the same little narrative with the same punchline and get a giant laugh, and then somebody who, as we say, is not funny, tells the same joke and the result is silence. Why? It's all has to do with timing, structure, pausing,
Delivery.
Language, delivery, all those things. And the same is true with writing. And not just in fiction, where we all acknowledge that because we all went to school and we took courses in fiction and we saw how, the opening of Madame Bovary works or something like that. But there's an art to nonfiction too. There's a reason why Richard Kapuscinski is more interesting to read than the AP or Reuters dispatch from this very same country. And it has to do not only with depth, but it also has to do with the teller of the tale and the skill with which it's told. And what we try to gather here are people that are great reporters, but also people that know a little something about how to do this. It's important not just to be able to sleep on the ground in a rock and gather information, but to be able to tell something that you're not going to find in the New York Times or Reuters or on television. It has to go somewhere beyond it.
What are you looking for in a story?
Well, that radically depends on what the subject is.
But often you tell the same. You're on the same field as New York Times.
I'm very interested. If you're asking me as a writer, I'm very interested in answering that question implicitly or explicitly of what so and so is like. What's Bill Clinton like? What's it like to be in the same room, universe, penumbra of Bill Clinton for 8 days constantly? We see him on TV, we think we know him, we think we know all about him. He was president for 8 years, and maybe he'll be, I don't know, first spouse for another 4 or 8, who knows. That question of what is he like, what is she like, what the same kind of thing that you begin to develop when you're doing a character study in a novel. But how do you develop this? It's by the accumulation of 100 or 1,000 details of dialogue, of physical detail, of behavior, of narrative. You don't find that very often in nonfiction writing, and the people that I look to publish are people that know what they're doing where this is concerned.
You're speaking as a writer now. How is it possible for you to both write a 20,000 word piece on Bill Clinton and at the same time edit the magazine?
I'll show you. That's the only reason.
You get high on Starbucks.
High on life.
Tell me, I don't. It's not enough.
That wasn't enough. Well,
how long time did it take you
to write the Clinton piece? Well, before I went out reporting, I did a lot of reading, and also Bill Clinton is not the least known personality in our political history. But once the reporting began, to the end of publishing, 2 months. But I was also doing my work here a bit. I took, a week out of the office. I'm not the slowest writer you've ever met.
And probably not the slowest reader either.
Yeah, this is something maybe. Well, you have to read certain kinds of things with one level of care and other kinds of things with another level of care. If you read the New York Post with the same care and attention in the morning as you give to a submission by George Packer or Alice Munro, then there aren't enough hours in the day. If you're ruthless about your time and learn how to either delegate authority in terms of running an office, or how to cut to the quick on certain other kinds of decisions, then you might find yourself with more time than you had before. And I'm bad at a lot of things, but I'm better at that.
You say it took you 2 months.
And also I have no other interests. I'm only half kidding. I have my family, and I have this magazine, and then there's the occasional piece that I write. That's it. I'm not on the board of the New York City Ballet. I don't have affairs. I don't run for office. I don't play golf. This is that's what I do, and I read.
You say it took you 2 months, and you were traveling with him, if I remember it right.
About 10 days.
About 10 days to Africa.
And did some interview. And then I also went to Arkansas for about, I think I went for a day and a half just to go down and interview him and see his museum library. And I went to New Hampshire for a day or two. There are certain kinds of stories that I can't do. I'm talking about as a writer. And by the way, this is a small part of my life here, a very small part of my life here. As a writer, there are all kinds of stories that take months and months to do, and I just don't do them.
How long time does a story normally take for the New Yorker?
It depends on the person. It depends on the subject. Betsy Colbert and I agreed that she would just take a year to write a series of articles on global warming. She took the whole year, and she ended up as 3 pieces, about 15,000 words apiece, and that's what she did for a year, and then it became published as a short book, quite good. Called Field Notes from a Catastrophe. On the other hand, somebody, for a Talk of the Town piece could take a day. It depends on the person. It depends on the subject.
An average story.
There is no average. It's a fake number.
Seymour Hersh, he says that the main reason he writes for the New Yorker is that you are the only paper that gives him unlimited time and resources. Is it true?
Well, I don't think if Cy Hersh took 5 years and produced nothing, and I thought he was at the beach, I don't think our patience would be unlimited. But Cy Hersh's record at the New Yorker is well known, so I'm willing to extend all the support I possibly can, not just because I like Cy, but because of what he does. That's not a difficult decision for me to make. I should say, though, by the way, that part of the reason that we can do what we do is that we are owned by the Advanced Publications, the Newhouse family, and they provide us with these resources. They don't demand that we make a 30% profit margin like this is what the Los Angeles Times is struggling with right now. The Los Angeles Times makes an enormous profit margin, but somehow the stock market tells them it's not enough because it's not a growth industry. So even though these newspapers under the Tribune Company make plenty of money to satisfy the wildest fantasies of you, me, or anybody else, the market says it's not enough, so the stock price either stays the same or goes down because newspapers per se are not a growth industry, and it's a public company. So they're constantly cutting and cutting and cutting, and sooner or later the cutting damages the newspaper. And suddenly you go from having 10 investigative reporters to 7, and you come up with some incredible rationalization why this is okay, and you rationalize yourself into mediocrity. We don't have that. The Newhouse family is very committed to this magazine. Even when we were losing money, they were very, very patient beyond human dimensions, I would say. So the fact that we are a successful business now, well, not like People magazine, not even remotely so, but at least that we make a healthy profit.
How much
yes,
is that profit?
It's a private company, so I can't describe it. That's part of the onus of being family owned. But it allows me to not have to stay up all night and worry about that part. I'd rather worry about Cy Hirsch or where we're going to get our next piece of good fiction. I want to worry about my job editorially.
But how important is it for you that the magazine is profitable?
I'm not willing to find out. You know what I mean? I'm not willing to find out what the consequences of being unprofitable are.
But
because the obvious, who knows? But I don't think people who own magazines are Medicis and willing to put up with unlimited losses for unlimited periods of time. They're not fools. So it's not an experiment that I want to carry out.
Let's go back to your editorial side. Let's stay a little bit with the fact checking, and let's get back to Seymour Hersh, Cy Hirsch. He describes the relationship between you and him as a constant conflict.
Good. It should be, and I think if he's describing it that way, what he means is, and I don't want to put words in Cy's mouth, that's the last thing I would do either as an editor or as a human being, is that I'm here not to, when he hands in his first draft, to say, Cy, this is brilliant, I believe every word of it. My job is to say, Cy, I'm reading this, and I'm not convinced of this part yet. This doesn't make sense. And I should tell you that people watching this probably know that a lot of the sources in a Cy Hirsch story or in any intelligence story are unnamed. So-and-so's a retired general, so-and-so's a 4-star this or that, and the name is not there. And this is greatly frustrating to a lot of readers. And I know it, and he knows it, but it's necessary. It's not as if General so-and-so is going to get up and I say, Donald Rumsfeld is the worst thing we've ever had here. That's the end of his career. But I know who they are. And the checkers, that's the rules of the road at the New Yorker. I get to ask, and you must tell me who the sources are, and the checkers as well. When we go to press, I want to be confident that any assertion of fact that we are making has been well sourced. Not because of the lawsuits that may come down the road, that's of secondary interest, but because of the journalistic and the public interest. So when we say that the United States did X, Y, or Z, and our sources are A, B, and C, if we can't name them in the piece, I want to describe them as fully as we possibly can without betraying any agreement. And I need to know who those people are, and the checkers need to speak to them. And they do.
And are people...
sources like this.
The sources
like this. First of all, obviously, a lot of these sources, some of them are repeat offenders. And they're used to it by now. And they know that we won't betray them. And they know or should know that we would pay a very heavy price to protect them, the ultimate prices, meaning going to jail if necessary. And that's where Cy and I, will get to know each other best in a jail cell if need be.
How would you describe your relationship with him?
I would never argue with Cy. It is has to be, I would describe it as extremely friendly, and then when we're down to business, it can get tough. Not acrimonious, not terrible, but it can get tough.
He says you're a very tough editor.
Good.
Are you? How would you describe yourself as an editor?
I think if I were to not be tough when the going gets tough, then you don't need me. And I don't want to flatter myself, but I'm here to serve a particular function, especially when it comes to investigative reporting. And if I just say on the first draft, when every writer, myself included, hands in a piece and it's not quite there yet.
When you
and it pays to put pressure on these pieces. I think editing, in my experience as a writer as well as an editor, what an editor often does is confirm the secret worst suspicions of the writer. The writer hands in a piece. He or she is confident of part A, a little less so of B, maybe even less so of C, and then confident of part D. But doesn't really say so, but you hand it in, and a good editor sees the holes, asks the question to put the pressure on. My feeling is, if we fight before publication, fine. As long as we fight productively. And I think fighting is a ridiculous way to put it. But if those discussions are tough before publication, fine. As long as they get the job done. Afterwards, we're fine. Then I'm his lion. Then I'm out there defending him up and down. Because I know the piece inside and out. And I've tried to put as much pressure on it as possible. The stakes are very high.
What would happen if he was proven wrong?
And he legitimately proven wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Then I would share in that mistake, and then we would correct our mistakes as quickly and as thoroughly as we possibly can.
And what would it mean to the credibility? I mean, if you say the stakes are high.
I think mostly what erodes the credibility of a publication or a network or whatever most, when they make a mistake, is to not admit it, and to not face up to it and not to correct it in a timely way. Part of what killed CBS and Dan Rather in that case was not so much that they made a big error. It's that they didn't recognize their error and continued insisting on what was patently a weak story. That was the bigger problem. That was a big problem. We've made mistakes. We make mistakes all the time. I hope they're not mistakes of an enormous scale. But the idea that the New Yorker, even with all its fact-checking, is somehow flawless is only a child would believe that.
In your Clinton piece, you had 3 fact-checkers checking if the tribal dancers were wearing skirts or dresses.
Mm-hmm. Very funny. Clinton arrived on the tarmac in, I guess it was Malawi, and he was greeted by tribal dancers and tribal singers, and the sort of usual kind of head of state visits a Central African country and Sub-Saharan African country, and I described the dancers as wearing skirts that have portraits of President Bingu on it, and the fact checkers somehow got photographs of the arrival ceremony and noticed that they weren't skirts at all, but they were dresses. Nobody ever accused me of being 100% accurate or of being a fashion expert, so I was corrected on both accounts.
And a normal editor would normally say, what does it matter? But you don't.
It makes all the difference in the world. Because if you don't correct small matters of fact, then this slope is very slippery, and the next thing you know, you don't think anything matters.
So tell me a little bit about fact-checking process.
How does it work?
Yeah.
Well, as early as possible, you hand in to the fact-checkers your draft. And they go through every single line of it. And every assertion of fact, every quotation, and they check it. They check it against your notes, they check it against speech texts, they check it against photographs, they call all the sources, they call people for help on background, they go to books, etc., etc. It's very, very painstaking, and the reason there were 3 for that was not only the length of the story, but also because we were trying to turn it around in fairly rapid order.
How many fact checkers is it normally on a story?
It's normally on a story,
Yeah.
just 1. Sometimes there are 2. On a sci-fi story that we're doing in 1 week, 2 or 3. or an investigative piece by Jane Mayer or Steve Coll or somebody like that. You want to, they're harder to check. You know, if you're doing a profile of an actress like Helen Mirren, and your writer has all the clippings there and the tapes, and well, you know that when it's going to run, and so you have one person working on it for a few weeks, and then that's. How
do the writers react to this fact checking?
I think if what you're hinting is some of them find this adversarial, I think that sometimes in the beginning when they're not used to it, they might. But after a while, you're so unbelievably grateful, because I don't know about you, but I make a lot of mistakes. And it's not because I know that the checkers will catch it. I'm actually very prideful, and I don't want them to catch everything. I want to hand in something that's reasonably, some clean laundry. But they seem to find all the stains and spots and help me out. And I'm immensely grateful.
Peter Canby, who is the head of your fact-checking department, he says that reporters are guilty until opposite has been proven.
I think if he's saying that in the right spirit, then I sure.
But there are also tensions between writers and fact-checkers, I understand from
okay.
my secret sources.
My first editor in the news business was Ben Bradley, and he used to call it creative tension.
Right.
I'm willing to have creative tension is a good thing.
He still writes for you now.
He just wrote a piece. He published a piece at the fledgling age of 82, I think he is.
With or without tensions?
It seemed to go okay.
How many?
Sorry about that.
What would you never publish? The art of an editor is to know what to publish, but as much know what not to publish.
Things that are made up, pieces that are boring, but boring in a way that have no redeeming value. Some things are kind of dull that have a redeeming value somewhere, hiding there. Things that I can find anywhere else.
I think we should take a break now because...
Yeah, hold on a second.
So I asked you don't print boring articles, you were just saying.
I'm sure we do print pieces that some readers find boring, but I try not to bore myself. But that's the only temperature gauge I've got. I can't guess what you're going to be bored by. I'm not, because then your neighbor will say something else.
How often does it happen that you kill articles?
Often enough.
What does that mean, more concrete?
What does it mean to kill?
No, I mean, how many stories? Is that stories?
I don't know.
But is it stories that people
Some things just don't work out. And some things don't work out at the early stage because they can't get access to somebody. Some things don't work out because, once in a blue moon, because somebody else publishes the same piece. And sometimes you kill it because the piece doesn't work. The piece that you wanted to write, you're not delivering on the promise of the piece.
What does it tell about the paper that the writers we are talking mostly about now, for instance, in this interview, are investigative reporters and not literary writers?
Because you haven't asked about it. I'd be happy to talk about any literary writers too. I mean, we were talking about reporting because you were asking about reporting.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is actually, is it a change of style in the New Yorker?
No,
the old style was more literary and eccentric.
No. I don't buy that. I've heard it. I don't buy it. I do think that we're living in a serious time. And if we don't recognize it, we don't recognize it at our peril. And what do I mean by that? I mean, not just September 11th, but just we're living in a serious time of challenges of culture and politics and war and ecology and the environment and all the rest. In a way that, in a sense, maybe the 90s seem to be, at least in American life, a foolish moment of forgetting. This is, say, a moment of real crisis in any number of areas of the world. So am I concerned about that? Am I trying to publish as many pieces of quality as I can about that? Absolutely.
Do you have political ambitions with the paper?
I do, but they're not political ambitions of anything different than what you would imagine, which is just to educate, to deepen knowledge, to persuade in areas where opinion is delivered
You endorsed the presidential candidate for the first time in the magazine's
because
history.
I thought it was foolishly decorous not to. You know, in other words, the comment section of the magazine has opinions of on all kinds of issues. Why in God's name wouldn't we say something about the most important decision, who's going to be the President of the United States? I just thought that was somehow...
Will you do it again?
Absolutely, I'd do it again.
And this was absolutely okay with the publisher, no thoughts about
Publisher I never cleared it with the publisher, and the publisher never said a word about it.
But the media...
But if you want to go back to the literary question, loads of magazines over time have gotten rid of fiction, for example, under the notion that most people that read fiction read novels that they buy at the store or on Amazon or whatever, and that fulfills their literary meal. I would never do that. The Atlantic, for example, no longer publishes fiction. Many magazines that did publish fiction don't exist anymore. The Saturday Evening Post, McCall's, and so on. It's a very important part of what we do. Last week's issue, for example, had not only quite a long short story, but also had a literary essay by Milan Kundera. We do this all the time. We have novelists writing essays as well as fiction.
Did Milan Kundera do that especially for you, or was it an excerpt?
Well, he wrote I think 7 or 8 essays that are going to be a book somewhere in Europe, and we went out and got it. But this always was like this. It was always like this. A lot of what William Shawn did in the 50s and 60s were books that were in manuscript. You go to publishers, you find them, and you...
But it also happened the other way around, that they were first published.
We do that too.
Yeah.
And it was first published in the New Yorker. This Kundera essay first saw the light of day in the New Yorker. It'll be in a book a year from now. And by the way, it automatically reaches an audience of 1 million. The number of people who buy a book of essays by Milan Kundera in this country is of some tiny fraction of 1 million. So you're bringing it automatically to a much wider audience.
Your predecessor, Tina Brown, she opened a new chapter in the history of the magazine. What was it she did that was so revolutionary?
She woke it up. She woke it up. In other words, the magazine is 80-odd years old. Most magazines, at least in the American experience, I don't know about in Europe, have a moment when they're important or vital or fun or interesting or serious, and then they either linger or they die. Take Life magazine as a popular magazine. Life magazine was really important in this country for a very broad audience, mainly because of its pictures. It brought the images of the Second World War and much else into the American consciousness at home. Its importance was in the 40s, the 50s, and maybe through Vietnam. But it lingered in various incarnations for another 20 years, even though it became radically less important. It had that moment. The Partisan Review, take a much more serious, highbrow version, which never had more than 5,000 readers, but was enormously important in the cultural, intellectual life of a slice of American life in the United States in the 50s. It lingered until just a few years ago.
So she woke it up.
When you have a magazine that's 80 years old, you can't expect that every second of the time will be as vital as the other. But if you're going to do something unusual, which is to make the New Yorker important in an ongoing way, every once in a while you have to prod the animal. You have to make sure that you have enough younger writers. You have to make sure that visually it looks like itself, but is also maybe modernized. And I think she did that in a number of ways.
How important is the history to the magazine?
I think it's very important. I think it's there to tell you, not to be nostalgic, not to have any sense that we're running a museum here and that I'm the curator, but to have an example behind you. Look, the New Yorker, even at its best, in its, depending on what years you might think that would be, published a lot of pieces that were dull, mediocre, or of very little lasting quality. But let me finish. On the other hand, and we will always do that, that's inevitable. There aren't 52 or 60 fantastic, brilliant, lasting short stories a year anywhere. But you have to keep reviving the sense of the magazine. You have to make sure that people that are in their 20s and 30s are getting in the magazine, that cartoonists are not all 75 years old, that you're encouraging and bringing along new ones.
And how much can the tradition be a burden?
Be a burden? Not at all.
Not at all.
I find it an inspiration.
Is it always like that? Is it not in the case of Tina Brown, when she awakened the magazine, there was a lot of discussions about length of article, if you of the serials, and if you could print pictures or color or things like that, where the tradition limited her?
If you are so weak that press chatter and people yapping and talking is going to make you draw in your horns or shrink from your convictions, then you don't deserve to be the editor of the magazine. It's even tougher when the Pentagon or the White House starts telling you that you're publishing things that are jeopardizing the lives of American troops or treasonous and all the rest. And if you don't have the strength to stand up to that, then you don't deserve to be sitting in that chair, and shouldn't be.
But there's always, it seems...
There's always everything. There's always somebody talking. Everybody has an opinion. It's like a salt shaker. Everybody has a salt shaker. Everybody has a nose. And it's interesting to hear those opinions, and sometimes it's even useful. But if you're going to trim your sails, if you're going to edit your magazine based on what the average opinion is out there, whether it's in the press or among the readers, then you don't need an editor. All you need is an accountant to figure out what all the opinions are.
Will the New Yorker always look the same, basically?
No. No, and it hasn't looked always the same. I think styles of art, styles of writing, we depend on individual talents. Writers are what's important here. We don't have an institutional voice that runs from page 1 to page 100. When A.J. Liebling died, when E.B. White died, when Janet Flanner died, that was the end of those voices for this magazine. They remain in memory as inspirations of paragons of a certain quality, but not for imitation.
How is the new media landscape affecting the New Yorker?
The internet?
Mm-hmm. Among many things that happen.
Among many things. Well, not a newspaper. We don't have the same complexities that a newspaper faces. The internet was something that we have faced maybe at a more deliberate pace than newspapers, because it's trickier to figure out how it works for a weekly magazine as opposed to for a daily newspaper where things are turning over all the time. I think ultimately it will work for us. It will expand our readership. People will read it on the internet. I think there are people who read it in both ways, and we'll see how it works. But I want to be there to have a terrific website for those who want it.
Okay. Let's wrap it up this way. Since you became the editor, the magazine has won 21 national awards. How important are prizes in journalism?
I think they're, you know, it's, I won a prize for a book that I wrote, and my 6th grade teacher called me. And
that was a Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah, and some friends called, and people said nice things, and I got, you know, my mother was very pleased and so on, and then it was over. You know, if I hadn't won that prize, that book would be what it was or what it isn't anyway, and I wouldn't have had that fun day of all those phone calls. But then the next day comes and you do your work. Is it fun to win these prizes? Yes. Do you feel grouchy for a day if something that you thought earned it and something lesser won it? Yes. None of us are above that. But all you have to do is remind yourself, and you're from Sweden, that Nabokov did not win the Nobel Prize and Pearl Buck did. That's how much prizes matter.
What do they matter for the magazine?
I think in the overall sense, it's a kind of shorthand way for people to be reminded maybe of the New Yorker's performance. But I should also say that there was a long period of time when these awards didn't exist at all, and people had no problem remembering how they felt about the New Yorker one way or the other.
Well, now it's
I
time.
don't dismiss them. I think that there's no phone call that I'd rather make than to call such and such writer and say, you just won a such and such award, and they feel great. That's nice. But then there's the next day.
Well, now it's time to announce the winner of Stora Journalistpriset for excellence in storytelling. What do you wish the winner?
I wish them to feel great today, and then I hope that it helps them to do even better work the next day and the next year. The one thing that a prize can do is encourage you, to sort of make you feel like someone's listening in a concrete way, and to push you forward. What you don't want a prize to be is a kind of benediction and a sense of ending, a sense of a peak. What you want it to do is gently shove you forward with even better things. Thank you.